performative demonstration in the future. You can't satisfy conditions for the future because all we have is now. But insofar as I perform it now, as now passes and recesses in time, quote unquote, it has happened in the past. I have the act now, and I have sort of the posited condition for demonstration at some point in the future. That will end up being very important because Moore doesn't want it to regress into sort of, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, he doesn't want it to regress into sort of time-dependent subjectivity, right? Especially not in a Berkeleyan sense, but I'll talk about that in a second. So now, I mean, it's important that we understand that, I apologize for those people who find this absolutely and utterly boring. This is rather boring stuff, but I love rather boring stuff because it's just, for me, I approach epistemology and everything that I do in life as a game, and I want to understand this game. And this is a rather absurd game to be playing by talking about a performative demonstration of external reality by gesticulating my hand, right? But there is reason in this, and the question is, I understand it. The question is, can you make sense of the reason that legitimizes this? Why has this 3-page, 4-page article been included in this work? There's some importance in this argument for it to have received the recognition in my time. And the point is, how do we get to understand really what's going on here? So what I'm going to do is, I'm now going to really facilitate what I think is hopefully going to be my contribution to epistemology, a very, very, very dense and rigorous analysis of what's at stake in this argument. Okay, so important, I'll just do one last sweep through this before I erase it. We understand the role of now because it sets up sort of this demarcated temporality, right, past, present, future, which is important if we want to talk about the continuity of our knowledge. What's important is to identify the conclusion. The conclusion is given in the first sentence. The proof as demonstrative proof will aid us, will facilitate us in arriving at the conclusion that two human hands exist. In the actual word mine in his analysis has a built-in assumption, a number of assumptions, and for fun you can try and deconstruct the amount of assumptions that are built into my. There's tons of them. And if I were teaching this as a class, I'd have the students deconstruct all of the assumptions in the word my. There are many. But my assumes Moore is a human, obviously, since his conclusion arrives at being a human, but there are many, many more assumptions built into that. You should be able to look critically at the term and deconstruct all of the assumptions built into that term. And then lastly, we have to identify the premise. And this is probably the most counterintuitive part, is that the premise actually is the performative demonstration. And this is my left hand, here, now, right? That performative demonstration is the condition with which we arrive at our conclusion. Thus, the performative demonstration in Moore's proof of external reality becomes the premise with which he legitimizes, with necessity, a conclusion that must follow, right? Because we recognize that insofar as we have a premise, the conclusion has to follow with necessity. So that should hopefully be clear. Okay, so let's move on. All right, so the three conditions needed to satisfy his proof. Right, so let's talk about the three conditions, right? Three conditions. Conditions needed to satisfy Moore's proof. First, and here's a direct quote from the text: unless the premise which I adduced as proof of, and last night, in all honesty, I had to go in and see how I was going to, because it seems circular, right? To say that I've adduced it is to say that it serves as an example for X. It's a representation, if you will, right? It serves as a rational example, a demonstration, if you will. So it sounds circular. It won't be. You'll see in a little bit. So let's go through this very, very slowly. So this is a direct quote. unless the premise which I adduced this proof of the conclusion was different from the conclusion I adduced it to prove. Very, very dense. Very, very dense. I'll read that one more time. In order for Moore to have satisfied the conditions for proof, he would not have been able to satisfy those conditions for proof, quote unquote, unless the premise, the demonstrative representation of hand and here and now, which I adduced as proof of the conclusion to, that is, the conclusion being two human hands exist now, was different from the conclusion I adduced it to prove. Okay? So what's important to recognize is, well, I mean, that is so dense, right? That is so dense because it's wordplay, but conceptually the concepts are not interchangeable, right? This reminds me of Plato's question, is the action just, no, is the action pious? Wait, is the act pious because the gods recognize it, or does the gods' recognition of the act make it pious, right? It's one of those things, right? Is the thing that I'm doing an act of piety, and because it's an act of piety, the God recognizes it, or is the recognition from God make your act pious, right? It's one of those things. The question is, in order for this to facilitate the conclusion, facilitate and satisfy the condition of proof, I have to make sure that the premise, which I adduced as proof of the conclusion, which I offered as an example, a demonstration of the conditions which would satisfy the conclusion, both represent, and as he says, both represent something new and different from what I have already derived in the conclusion, right? Otherwise, it would be tautological. So here's the explanation for it. It's very, very complicated. And this is where epistemology gets difficult, but I'm going to try my best to offer this in a way that it makes sense. And I'm sort of not going to give up the point precisely because it's so difficult to understand, right? But I want to make it clear. So here's what I say. So this is 1A. Explain. If, for example, the premise is A, if the premise is A, and the conclusion is A, and my conclusion is A, then we have something that is true, right? And we also have a demonstration of proof. A is A, right? If A, then A, right? I can say A is A. For those of you who know the later argument for identity, you can, and this is where I say you can watch this lecture series on many levels. For those of you who know the argument for identity, then we recognize that identity becomes, in this, the demonstration of proof, right? I'm offering this as an example to make sense of what Moore is saying with respect to adducing the premise, as he says, adducing the premise he says, the premise which I adduce as proof of, right, as proof of the conclusion has to be different, right? So if, for example, the premise is A and the conclusion A, then the truth of the proof is rooted in the identity of A, right? The proof of the conclusion, right, antecedent conclusion, the proof of the conclusion is rooted in the identity of A. Okay? However, this is tautological, right? This argument becomes tautological because B-E-C-A. Because there's only 3 lines in E. Because there is no difference, right? There is no difference. There is no difference. What Moore wants is difference. He wants a distinction between, he wants to have arrived at something different. I don't want to use the term new, but he wants to arrive at something new, right? It's a transformational, in a sense, right? It's a transformational account. It's not a redundancy. It's not that there's a problem in tautological argumentation. It's not a problem that tautological argumentation doesn't arrive at truth. But as Hume said, yes, there is truth in tautological argumentation. However, it's essentially meaningless, right? Because all you are doing is making an affirmation of identity, right? Insofar as you're making an affirmation of identity, you really haven't arrived at anything new. You've reaffirmed, you've reassessed what is, via identity. What Moore wants to do is he